country that is noted as the best. From north to south, from east to the west. A country that was found by a sailor. A country they gave the name Australia. But little do they know of the thirst of Australians who was here first. For some land they used to call their home. For some land that they called their own. I remember how they used to walk for miles to hunt for food in order to survive. They knew the land as far as it was spread. When nighttime come, they use it for their bed. A minority group, the smallest in the world, headed on to land they call reserves, crushed by invaders who took away our land. Enough's enough.
I was born at Warren-Gesda, and about it'll be 74 years ago, on the Murrumbidgee. My mother taught us a lot, and she was of the Murray River tribe. My two sisters were born on the Murray River, and two of us were born on the Murrumbidgee. But we used to love to get with the old people. It was out on a summer night especially, and they'd sing in the old language, and with the teachers to do the corroboree. Our people were like one big family.
Yes, we had quite a good social life. There used to be the claypan dances, and one event that was especially looked forward to was the visit of the Burraga people. That was the mission at Cummeragunja. They used to come down each year and supply half the concert. There was a violin player from Cummeragunja, and we had our violin player. We'd all join in and form a sort of band. We had a pretty good life there. There was plenty to eat. We were not dependent on the government for food or anything. We were totally independent of that type of help.
Throughout the 1900s, many white settlers moved into the outback of New South Wales. The smaller towns grew, and the demand for consumer goods and fresh food increased. White farmers cleared more land of wildlife and brought in herds of cattle and sheep. The farmers pressured the state government to release Aboriginal reserve lands for farming. On the reserves, the Aborigines Protection Board planned to break up the Aboriginal communities and sell off the land. The board began by removing the rights of Aborigines to own and use reserve lands. From now on, Aborigines would own nothing.
A lot of the men were very keen on having farms of their own, and they sent a petition to the board asking for land, and they were given so much land down near the river, and they were very enthusiastically cleaning it up and chopping all the trees down, and they planted crops. As a child, I remember that vividly. It was something for us to see, this wheat which was grown by our own people. Then all of a sudden, the board informed them that they were taking the land back again. And it proved that, you know, Aborigines had no rights whatsoever. And I really think that's what broke the spirit of the men who had done all that work really for nothing.
In 1909, the Aborigines Protection Board placed white managers in control of every Aboriginal reserve in New South Wales. The manager was given full powers over the lives of the people living there. The reserves were made a training ground for the Aboriginal children to become servants. The Protection Board's plan was to then remove the children from the reserve and place them under the control of white employers. Once removed, these children would never be allowed to return home.
The manager lived like people that live in very nice homes with plenty of money, and he just got what he wanted. He got his biggest share of the meat and milk, and everything that was given to the people, they rang a bell for. We got flour, sugar and tea, and they also gave fat, which you could smell a mile off when you started to cook it. It was so smelly, and our people had to take that.
The manager used to keep a pretty tight rein on us. He wasn't a qualified teacher, couldn't teach above third class. Most of our time was spent out working in the gardens or digging trenches, pit toilets, etc. A lot of manual labour instead of being educated. The only thing I learned was how to work.
At Hermannsburg Mission Station, the children are given a rudimentary education, and when their lessons are over, it is amusing to see them pour out of school just like ants out of an anthill.
It was a one-roomed little place, and it only had 8 desks, 4 on each side, 4 on this side and 4 on that side. And we really didn't have any education, because most of the time the teacher would be at his place having a cup of tea or be sleeping out on the front veranda.
Asking you to take over?
And he used to ask me to teach the children. And I knew nothing, that I'd be walking around in front of the class with a cane, and they'd say to me, "Oh, you think you're somebody great," and I'd give them a whack with the cane for giving me cheek because I was a teacher. And so anyhow, I'm really self-taught. We both are, self-taught. I never learned anything at school.
Protection Board inspectors travelled to reserves throughout the state to pick out children who had reached the age of 13 and have them sent into the control of white employers.
Yes, Mr. Donaldson, we used to call him a superintendent. He was an inspector. He used to come once a year to the mission, and the parents didn't want him to know a lot of things. And we'd be warned to be pretty careful in any questions that he asked us, how we'd answer. I remember he used to come out with a great bag full of boy lollies, and after he'd finished speaking to us in the classroom, he would walk to the door, get us all out in the yard and throw the lollies out on the ground as if we were fowls, feeding fowls.
Well, we used to hide in the sugar cane. When he came, while we were in the sugar cane, we'd have a good old feed of sugar cane because we had strong teeth then. But he picked the girls he wanted sent away. Then one day he came on, but it was just after that when Mr. Howard brought a policeman over one Saturday. And they asked my mother, would she agree to send me down to Sydney? He told me that I'd have pretty frocks, I'd be going to parties, and all that kind of thing. And I knew he was telling lies. Even at that age, I wasn't stupid.
One day the manager came over to our island, Alagundi Island, and told me that I was to go and work for them. And he wasn't living on the island. He was because there was too much flooding for them. So anyway, I went along with it because you couldn't do anything else. You just had to go. When I got over there, I was told I was to work for them, and I was only 12 years of age.
The children in school used to stand on the desks and look out the window in a motor car. The days of when we very rarely saw a motor car. And the officials came for us with a policeman in it. Policeman in the car, and it was Mrs. Hill that was teaching us, and she sent the two boys to run like mad. Must have been about 3/4 of a mile over the river to tell my mother. Anyway, she must have ran all the way back because she still had her apron on. And she put her arms around the three of us and said, "You're not taking them." He said, "Well, I'll have to use this if you don't," patting the case with the handcuffs in it, But we, in our childish imagination, we thought it was a gun. And could have both yelled in together, we'll go, Mum, we'll go, And he was very kind. He tried to be, very kind. My mother said, "Well, I'm going too." And she still had her apron on, and went 25 miles to Deniliquin, and we weren't there very long when the car took us then to Finley and on the train to Cootamundra. That's a train. Well, I heard years later how my mother cried and cried, and she went out. She had nowhere to go, and she went out into the bush, and my older aunt and them who were told them as they were coming past a certain point right out on the outskirts of Deniliquin, they heard us moaning like an animal, and they stopped the buggy and went over to see, and they discovered that it was my mother lying under this tree and in the tall grass crying. She couldn't moaning, she couldn't cry anymore, and they had to care for her and look after her, but we were already on our road, the way, or might have been in Cootamundra by then, by train. But I often wonder how many other children were taken like that, just like animals, because our hearts were absolutely broken.
The younger boys were taken to the Kinchler Training Home for Aborigines, where they were given some training as farm labourers and handymen before being sent out to work on cattle or sheep stations throughout the state. The younger girls were taken to the Cootamundra training home to be trained by Protection Board matrons as domestic servants before being sent out into their apprenticeship.
But assistant matron was pretty tough, and I think she really had to. I suppose she felt she had to be, but she was the one that taught us the cooking and house work and things. When we were there at that training school, we used to go around to the back of the homes and have a weep, 2 or 3 of us, you know, for our home. We were supposed to know all about a stove and the cooking in it, but all the things that we cooked we were very lucky to be able to have it to cook. Was the ingredients was a damper, and mostly when we didn't have the stoves, it was in the ashes, and pretty nice when I come to think of it too. They tasted, but actually, after a couple of teachings, she expected you to know, you know, before we'd realise we'd have a real hard smack in the face. I can remember a girl's mouth bleeding with the punishment that she had, and we were scared stiff before they even went in to the kitchen to learn, you know, the cooking. But I feel that their teaching was very strong, and I have marks on my body right now from the beltings I had, you know. I was only there about 3 months before they took me with another girl to Sydney, where we were collected off the train by two policemen, 2 burly big policemen.
Let us sing a song of a Sydney town, fairest city of our land.
Many of the girls were taken to work in the homes of middle-class whites in the cities. These employers, or masters as they were called, were selected and approved by Protection Board inspectors. They were to be responsible for the training, welfare and wages of any Aboriginal child in their employment.
I was only 13, you know, when I first went there, and then I had to wash the baby's nappies and one thing and another, you see, and thing I never had to do home or didn't know anything about, so I used to hide some of them in the autumn, and she found them, and she was that mad with me that she rubbed them all over my head and my face. So, I mean, that was another thing.
They used to wake me up at 5:30 in the morning, and I had to do everything, the washing, the ironing and cooking, and I hardly knew how to cook, but I pretty soon learned. I worked 7 days a week. Whatever had to be done in the house, I did it. At Cameron's, Mr. and Mrs. Cameron's, it was 1 and 6 a week. A shilling into a trust fund with the AP board, and 6pence a week pocket money for me. But I never ever got that 6pence. And different people have said to me, why didn't you ask for it? But you just didn't do those things. If I'd have asked for it, I probably would, you know, said, well, I'm putting it, she probably would have said, oh, I'm putting it away for you, or something like that. But she dressed me not well. I didn't wear a pair of shoes until I was, all the time I was with her. Children were always well dressed and that. And now these were missionaries, more or less, and preaching the word of God to you. They drummed it in our ears from morning till night. For some reason or other, I don't know what I did, but I wasn't supposed to have any tea. I was to go without tea that night. And but I was in the kitchen to say grace. You say grace in there, then they send you out. So I sat on the veranda outside. The next thing I hear this little boy, his name was Colin, crying, and his mother just pushed him out the door and closed the door on him. He just flew over to me. I put my arms out, and And he just cuddled me around the neck, and then I said to him, I said, don't cry, don't cry. And he stopped crying. And I think the mother must have missed him crying. And the next thing, she opens the door and saw me with my arms around him and his around me. And anyway, she came over to me and grabbed the little fella and took him away from me, and she turned around, she said to me, don't you ever put your hands on that boy again. And I thought to myself, there's that poor little boy, he just wanted comfort. And this is, I don't know whether she thought that the black was going to rub off on the white or what, but those are kind of things that you had to put up with. You're not allowed to get fond of the children. You don't show them any love or anything. You're just there, just to look, do the work.
In the house and out the door, chopping wood and scrubbing floors, washing, ironing, mending too, sometimes making kids but just you. I'll do it all for Jesus. I'll do it all for Jesus. I'll do it all for Jesus. He done so much for me.
Yes, I mean it was just quite an ordinary thing to be called Richard Black and or a savage or anything like that. And years later, I just realized that I was a Richard Black. I was miserable, and I tried to take. I don't know if I told you, but I took poison. It was rough on rats, but it was pretty rough on me, believe me. Well, I ran away in the end, I reached the age, you see, of 15 or 16, and being caged up and not seeing people my own age was a bit, I didn't realize that I was growing up. I went out, somebody I went out with, my sister, I think it was, she ran away too, but she managed to get away. She's darker than I, and we used to go across in the ferry boat, at Mossman Bay, for rides at first. But then I got a little bit further and further, you see.
After I served my apprenticeship, I was 19 years of age then, and then I went around to see my mother. I heard that she wanted to see me, so I went around to see her and knocked on the door, and she came to the door, and we were just like strangers, absolutely strangers. We just didn't, more or less, there was nothing there, and
looking back on it now, I could see it as a type of slave labour. But the mission was supplying cheap labour for the stations round about, housemaids. Lots of the girls came back pregnant and lived with their mothers on the reserve until they ended up living with one of the men on the reserve. A lot of them came back with half-caste children, It was pretty bad.
By 1930, over a third of Aboriginal children had been sent into apprenticeship. Many ran away. Some were caught, but others made it home. The Protection Board, seeing that they couldn't keep the children away from the reserves as planned, issued orders to managers to set up marriages. The girls' training might have a civilising effect on the men.
On our reserve, Cummeragunja Island, the manager's wife, she arranged marriages for these girls that came from Sydney back up there, because they'd been down here and served there 5 years. And anyway, she arranged the marriages, and And they all got married. She introduced them to each other, and I don't know what she said, but anyway, they ended up at the altar. When I went home to her, she tried the same thing on me. She got in touch with him, and we had to meet down, somewhere. And anyway, I saw him, and honestly, I didn't have any feelings. He may have, but and I said to him, "I'm sorry." I said, "But I just want to be single a little bit longer."
The Protection Board still wanted to close down the reserves and refused to spend any more money on their upkeep. In the early 1930s, sickness spread through many reserves. Again, young Aborigines were forced away from their homes to travel the state looking for work. On the road, things were just as bad. The 1930s in Australia were depression times. Over 1/3 of the workforce was out of work and on the road as well. For the first time, a lot of whites met with Aborigines and saw the terrible conditions they were forced to live under. Those Aborigines who made it to the city found that things were just as tough.
Hungry, out of work, kept alive on handouts. There's so many now, I don't even stand out. It's a prison, we just have to get out. Join together now, and we'll fight our way out.
Out of these hard times grew the feeling that people had to get together and organise to make changes.
That the task of the Communist Party today is one thing and one thing alone, and that is to smash fascism. Peaceful social change, and we will fight to the last for peaceful social change.
Actually, we were finished then from we reached the age of 21. They couldn't keep us any further, but then I went to Melbourne, and the lady that I stayed with, and her husband was George Franks. He was the head of Trades Hall and this and that and everything, Well, he was a well-known communist too. He used to take me to all the meetings. They were very interested in the downtrodden people. Well, I felt that my people were very downtrodden, I wasn't backward in coming forward and saying what I felt, They seemed to speak a lot of what I was feeling, It built up my thinking. It came out in words then, you see, and it was a wonderful way of putting my people's plight in the eyes of the world. I feel so much. What can we do to save them? Save our people of the different tribes. To do this, we must have equal rights so that my people can have the same opportunities as our white brothers and sisters.
It's all in the book.
Other Aborigines who came to the city to escape the Protection Board rule began to take the platform and speak out publicly.
It quite amuses me to hear the people saying I'm a black man, but he's damn glad to live in a black man's country all the same. I'm calling a corroboree of all the natives of New South Wales to send a petition to the King in an endeavour to improve our conditions. All the black man wants is representation in federal parliament. there is also plenty fish in the river for us all, and land to grow all we want. 150 years ago, the Aboriginals owned Australia, and today he demands more than the white man's charity. He wants the right to live.
For the first time, the newspapers supported them and their voices began to be heard. All over the country, Aborigines and whites were reading and hearing about the conditions on the New South Wales reserves. Aborigines began to organise. In 1932, an Aboriginal elder, William Cooper, came to Melbourne to start the Aborigines League. The aims of the League were to get equal rights for Aborigines. William Cooper had started a petition to the King of England, and he travelled to reserves throughout the state asking Aborigines to sign it.
He'd come up here and talk to the people and tell them they had rights and they should press for it. He asked to have a member of Parliament, Aboriginal member, so that Aborigines could go to that member and talk with him, where they couldn't relate to a white person because they knew that he just, scrap it all and forget about it. All the petitions they ever had was put in the waste paper basket. He worked really hard and went around getting names, and I believe it would cover so many miles, all the names. It was that long.
After 6 frustrating years of campaigning, William Cooper presented the petition to the federal government in Canberra.
It was just a waste of time. That poor man did all that work and nothing was done about it. It was to be sent to King George. I don't think it ever left Australia.
In 1937, an Aboriginal shearer, Bill Ferguson, arrived in Sydney to set up his Aborigines Progressive Association. He got the support of a fiery speaker and writer, Jackie Patton. Together they set the aims of getting full citizenship rights and the scrapping of the Aborigines Protection Board. They used every possible means to broaden their support, not only from Aborigines, but from Australians in general. Ferguson travelled to the reserves to get young Aborigines to join him in the fight.
And I was quite interested when I learned that he was coming to Brewarrina to hold a meeting. I attended the meeting, and when he asked for a delegate to attend a conference in Dubbo, I was nominated as a delegate to go to the conference at Dubbo. The membership was wholly Aboriginal, and there was a resolution passed that we visit the North Coast missions and to organise those people. We had, on the back of the old Chev 4 that we were travelling in, Bill Ferguson and myself, we had this large banner right across the back in big 6-inch letters. It was written, "Full citizens' rights for the Aborigines." And Bill's son, as we used to pass through the towns, we'd slink down to hide ourselves from the people so that they wouldn't see us sitting in the car, because we didn't want them to recognise us. When we pulled up for petrol, if there was a policeman present at all, he'd always walk over and ask Bill for his licence, check it out. And it just showed that we were sort of held in suspicion or something.
Progressive Association organisers travelled to reserves all over the state, gathering evidence of the conditions their people lived under. Meetings were held on reserves, and local branches of the Progressive Association were set up. Aborigines were starting to speak out on the reserves and were making demands for change. The Protection Board responded by bringing in regulations that gave tougher powers to the managers.
If some man had Had a run-in with the manager. He was disqualified from the mission, blackballed we called it, and wasn't allowed within a 5-mile or 25-mile radius of the mission, and would have to leave his family behind. And they used to have to creep back at night to see their families. These men were considered a bad influence on the people because they were so outspoken. We were regarded as agitators and therefore not allowed onto Aboriginal reserves. And lots of places the people were all behind Bill. They came out and bought membership tickets to enable us to get from one place to another. And we got a lot of support from all of those people with whom we came in contact on that trip.
Bill Ferguson returned to Sydney to push for an investigation into the Protection Board. The state government was under pressure, and the Premier of New South Wales, Stevens, announced that a select committee of inquiry was to be formed. Stevens placed his own government members as the majority on the committee. Reserve managers were brought to Sydney to present their side of the case. Bill Ferguson, representing the Aboriginal people, was then allowed to question witnesses and present his evidence. The press went to town. Ferguson's evidence hit the headlines and the Protection Board was exposed. The government majority on the committee refused to take any further part in the investigation and the inquiry collapsed. On the last day, a protest was held at Parliament House. Members of trade unions, housewives associations and the Feminist Club turned up. The investigation was dead, but support for Aborigines had spread.
Yes, well, after the visit of the Select Committee, the things seemed to cease in regards to boys being apprenticed out and that sort of thing. I only know of 3 or 4 girls who were sent out after the visit of the Select Committee. The only boy who had reached an employable age, they could go out and take a job at droving or station work. They weren't interfered with. So I think Bill did stir something up in that regard.
But white managers continued to rule the reserves, and the people still existed on handouts. The men were forced to work for little or no wages. The Aborigines Progressive Association planned to hold the first national Aboriginal protest while the whites celebrated their 150 years of settlement.
Australia today takes her place among the nations. We are building a great industrial civilization on this primary basis and developing a new race, a new force in the culture of mind and body. In this sunny land, sport builds a racial physique equal to any in the world. Australian history already bears the blazonry of glory won by our volunteers on the battlefields of the Great War. Yet only 150 years ago, Australia was still a nameless island inhabited by savages. To mark this proud record of progress, the government of New South Wales decided to celebrate with 3 months of pageantry and carnival.
Part of the celebrations was to be a reenactment of the landing of the first white settlers in Sydney. Aborigines called it a day of mourning. The Progressive Association sent handbills to Aborigines all over the country, urging them to attend the first all-Aboriginal conference on that day. Meanwhile, the Protection Board had brought a group of Aborigines from west of the state to take part in the white settlers' reenactment. Aboriginal organisers tried to fine them. They wanted to ask them not to participate, but the Protection Board had them locked up in the police compound next to the dog kennels. They had been brought to Sydney under the threat of having their rations cut off.
History flames into life as the dramatic scenes of the first landing at Circular Quay are reenacted at Palm Cove. We see the natives gathering in corroboree to ward off the invaders, just as they then did. In the face of menacing savages, the white men advance up the shore of the new land.
There appear to be no women amongst them. Is there any likelihood of an ambush?
So a handful of Englishmen took possession of a continent, a vast, unknown, primeval land.
While the celebrations took place, Aboriginal delegates gathered outside the conference hall in silent protest at their treatment. Inside the conference, speeches were made, and Bill Ferguson broadened the aims to include freehold land rights for Aborigines. At the end of the conference, Jackie Patton read the resolution. We, representing the Aborigines of Australia, hereby make protest against the callous treatment of our people by the white men during the past 150 years. We want full citizens' rights and equality within the community. On the reserves, agitation against the Protection Board continued, and the board tried to force the people off the land. On a reserve called Cummeragunja, the board leased the best land to white farmers and brought in a new manager named McGuigan.
I know that one man who has now passed on came over to see McGuigan whether if he would let someone take a very sick man into town, and he just laughed at him and said no. He said, and he pulled a revolver out. This is what he told us. He said he pulled a revolver out, and he said, I never crawled in my life to any white man. He said, but I crawled that day. He said, I was afraid he was going to shoot me. Those that had children going to school, their children got some rations, which went in a day. Apart from that, the rest of the people, well, they could just starve. I went around with a petition because so many babies had died. In fact, 2 died on one day, and we were horrified at the deaths that were happening. And so I went around to a lot of the mothers, and they signed it. And I went to people who had lost their babies, and they were afraid to sign because the ones that had their husbands working here were afraid what would happen. They'd have their rations stopped, they'd have the jobs taken away.
Petitions were sent to the Protection Board, asking them to remove the manager. Nothing was done. In February 1939, the Aborigines Progressive Association sent Jackie Patton to Cummeragunja.
And he came to tell the people how things were and why they were, telling them about their rights. And he held a meeting in the hall. He asked permission, he got it. And when he walked onto that stage, a policeman walked in the door and stood there and listened to the meeting. I think they were on for arresting him that day. They had to go and look up something in the law which said no one was allowed to incite Aborigines to revolt or, you know.
The day after Patton's arrest, the people of Cummeragunja took action. They walked off the reserve and began the first Aboriginal strike.
You know, Aborigines had been browbeaten and so long, and the strong ones, they said, let's go. So they moved over the river. They went over the river in boats. They went round in the old punt with their beds and anything they needed over there.
The strikers left New South Wales and crossed the river into Victoria, where the Aboriginal laws were more progressive. But the Victorian government refused to give them support. They said it was a New South Wales problem.
And we moved off the mission. we had a very big struggle. We lived in a tent and with a little girl with heart trouble. We were determined to live our lives in freedom for ourselves and our children.
The strikers were without food or funds. All over the country, Aboriginal organisations began to raise money. In Melbourne, the Aborigines League started a campaign to get support for the Cummeragunja people.
I was pretty young then too, but we had meetings on the Yarra Bank and spoke about the plight of our people where they went on strike for better conditions and not the small handouts that the government gave us, you see. And I had an Aboriginal concert party going then, and I played the ukulele and sang, and we held concert parties all over the place to get funds. The Aboriginal League, with our white supporters, went around shaking the collection tin. The trade union, especially the waterside workers, gave like anything. We got hold of someone's car and loaded it up with food, milk for the little babies up there, and drove up to the strikers' camp. They had money given to them, and the men would have a meeting and decide, also the women, and decide what they needed most. And then they, all the ones that were working over in Shepparton on the fruit would come over and bring cases of fruit over, pears, peaches and whatever they could to help. And they really had people backing them as they'd never had before. The strike lasted for several weeks, and I think it gave them courage to get away from the place, which was degrading us.
The Aborigines League pushed for an investigation into the cause of the strike. But at the start of World War II, there were stories in the press that Nazi agents were behind the strike, and public support fell away.
Australia is free. Perhaps in the past, too free. Nowhere could this be better illustrated than in Sydney's great domain. It is here the free speech has been allowed to all. We had a visit from one who started this craze on a pleasure cruise, he said, forgetting to mention that it was a pleasure cruise organized by the government of Germany. Even away in the little-known interior, amongst the primitive natives, there are townships where agents of Hitler wait and plan for the downfall of a country that has sheltered them and given them security.
Jackie Patton, like other Aboriginal organisers, came under pressure to stop campaigning.
He said that he believed that they were going to have him up for sort of treason, and which was ridiculous. And he enlisted and went overseas. And I had a lot of letters from him from over there. But, he was very homesick.
All out to guard. Most unusual guard this in all the Empire's armies. At Wangaratta Camp, Victoria, we meet the only all-Aboriginal squad in the AIF, Original Aboriginal Anzacs. They're not in the army as a curiosity. They are volunteers in the service of the country they love. With fixed bayonets instead of the spears their forefathers carried, with bullets instead of boomerangs, the dark-hued diggers go into action. Now out of uniform into civvies for a change, like good soldiers ready to do or dive. 6 little digger boys out on the spree. Half were torpedoed, and then there were 3.
Many Aborigines joined the armed forces and went overseas to fight and sacrifice their lives for their country. At home, the Aboriginal organisation slowed down, but their agitation had some effect. In 1941, the Protection Board was abolished. After the war, Aboriginal soldiers returned home to a country where they were not even citizens. Aboriginal organisations quickly emerged. A new generation of Aborigines began the long campaign to win back public support and to continue their struggle.
I feel very, very proud of those old people. They were fighters and they struggled in every way. They were fighting for better conditions and better understanding, which we're still doing.
Well, I think there's been a big impact because if the APA hadn't been started in the way it was started, that we wouldn't have the organisations that we have today. It may have been a long time in coming, but the organisations have been set up that have been a great help in our fight. But it doesn't end there. We've still got to go on fighting. We still have to battle because there's a long way to go yet. We have yet to get land rights. We've got to fight towards that goal.
The early fighters began the foundation of today's Aboriginal organisations. Today, the struggle still goes on and will continue to go on until justice prevails. Because we were the first Australians, and this is our land.